Now, my twin, he was all city center at Meade High School. And then he went to Notre Dame. And his first year, he blew his knee out. So he finished his engineering degree, mining engineering. And he went to work in the mines, developing all these tunnels and all this kind of shit. Brilliant mind. But he was a stinking drunk. You know, I couldn't be around him. He was a drunk. And I made up my mind I wasn't going to do that, you know. So when I quit drinking November the 13th, 1967, that's the last time I had a drink in my lifetime. It's never going to happen again. And he died of a brain tumor. They called him Conehead when he was in the hospital, for God's sake. His head started to grow up. He had a 4 or 5 inches high. He had a cone on his head where that tumor was growing and pushing out his skull. Literally. And I stayed with him until he died. And they correlated it with alcoholism. He was at the VA hospital in Colorado Springs, Colorado. "35 years. A long time. For me, to stay in one place? Oh, hell, I'd never done it in a lifetime. But I wanted to have a family life. You know, I wanted to understand how it's to be family. And I never had a family myself. See, when the folks passed away, they separated all us kids. I never saw them till I come back from Korea the second time. I was in Korea the first time in 53 and then come back and then went back in 57. I had some unfinished business to take care of there. And so I went in 57, then I sat on the seawall in Kunsan, Korea and painted sampans and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, I come back from there and I went to Las Vegas. We went all over. I went all over and set up junkets for people to go back to Las Vegas and gamble. Because I had no desire to work in a casino. I'd just dealing cards, none of that stuff appealed to me. But I like to gamble. Lost $100,000 one night playing blackjack. Made some money. Didn't matter. It wasn't the money. It was the adrenaline rush you get like going into combat, you know. It's the same thing. No difference. When you're on a winning streak, there's nothing feels like it. When you're losing, you just walk away. And it's out of your mind. You forget it immediately. Verna Marie Black come down and interviewed me. And I went there for 6 months. And I was on a work release facility. Because even though you had a commutation of sentence, you'd been locked up so long that they felt that you were out of touch with what was going on, and that was true. I was. And so I walked from Western State Hospital, it's about 12 miles. I walked from there to the Puyallup tribe every day. And between Verna and I, we set up a treatment program. The minute I was done with that, I said bye-bye. And of course, then I went to stay with Leroy. And, you know, the rest is history. That's what I've been doing. I bought fish from the Indians. I paid them 5 cents more than anybody else. I was knocking in $10,000 a week in fishing season. Whew. Fireworks season. I loaned them money to buy fireworks. I made money there. And then I needed a break. You know, if I was making $500,000, it'd be a different story. So then I went to work at Century House because the parole officer that I knew, Theron Morgan, he said, "Michael, I can get you a job there for a while while you cool off," you know. And so I went to Century House, and I knew I was going to stay there. I mean, I was there for 4 months, and I said, "I got to do something different." She says, "Well, you know, they're going to start treatment in the state of Washington." And I knew that to be true because a guy by the name of Brad Breslin was sent to the penitentiary for drug-related offenses. He filed a suit into federal court. He filed a suit of habeas corpus, and then he had to file another suit of mandamus. And the federal government says, yes, the state of Washington has to provide treatment for these guys. And he already had, in the penitentiary, he had social treatment opportunity programs, or STOP programs, where he was educating convicts that were inside the penitentiary to come out and try to be clean and sober. So I says, I think I'm going to go talk to Brad about a branch of STOP programs. And Karen says, can I go with you? I hate this place. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll go find a place. I'll set it up. And if you'll do all the paperwork, because I'm not doing paperwork, that's dead and stinking. I'm not going to do it. Then I'll do the lecturing and everything else that's necessary. She says, you betcha. So I went up on top of the hill, and there was a building up there, and a guy by the name of Doug Fields owned the building. And I walked in, and I sat down and started talking to him. And I said, Doug, I want to lease your building. I want to start an alcohol and drug treatment counseling facility in this building. And he says, well, it'll be so much a month and so much this. And I says, let me tell you right now, I don't have a dime. But I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you my word that I won't run out on you. And when we're done here, if you want to sell this building, I'll sell it for you. He looked at me, he says, are you serious? I said, my word's my honor. He says, I believe you. So he did it. I said, oh, Doug, there's one more thing. We'll need telephones. 2 of them. He says, boy, I've never met anybody like you. And so he got the phones hooked up. And I was able to scrounge some chairs and a couple couches. And that's how we started. And Karen started with me. She worked for a year for nothing. For nothing. Come up there every day like clockwork, 12 hours a day. At the end of that year, she started getting paid. At the time we were done being there, I went downtown and found this building, 1990. And I made a deal with Carpenter to buy to lease this building. And he put it to just exactly what we wanted it, because it was empty, gutted. And so we'd have these offices, the bathrooms, and the big rooms with a divider so we could have 2 different groups. And we started bringing in the people. And then I realized that when I started doing these groups, there was nothing there, because all they wanted to do is sit around and talk about their stories. So when I'd start giving them information and telling them their stories, I mean, they'd interrupt and tell me, well, I did this and I did that and I had this problem and I had that problem. And I said, wait a minute, this may be working for these guys because it gives them control and puts me in the background. It had nothing to do with ego. It had nothing to do with ego. It had to do with what was right. So I listened to the guy on the television, and he was talking about lecturing, and boom, the light went off in my head. And he said he was very successful. He was in Arizona. And so then I spent 3 weeks doing research and reading books and writing notes in my notebook. That was before I had them typed like this, And one Monday morning on about the 4th, maybe the 5th intensive outpatient program that we had here, not up on the hill, but here, I come in with 17 folders, notebooks, and I handed them out to everybody with a pen. And I says, every day I'm going to put a lecture on the board. And your job is copy my notes. My notes will be better than yours. And the second half, we're going to talk about what you learned from these notes today. So that's how it began. And all of a sudden we started getting people in here. We had, don't tell anybody, but we had 30 people in a group at night, 25 in the morning. And I'd lecture both morning and night. And they all filled out their notebooks. And over a period of time, I realized I was doing the right thing. So when they had group processing, we had another counselor by then. So I sent them in here to the group processing. I says, you're not going to talk about what they did when they're stinking drunks or when they was using drugs. You're going to talk about what they learned from the notes that they took down. And what I began to realize that when they write the notes down, they were reinforcing exactly what I was talking about. So what does it do? It allows it to go from the short-term memory into the long-term memory. And that become highly successful. Half a dozen other agencies started doing the same thing. They got more clients, and they had more successful clients because they were participating. They weren't talking about all this crap and blaming their mom and dad and that kind of crap. And so that's how it really began to make sense and make it really work. And we did that for a long time. And everybody was happy. Clients was happy. The counselors was happy because I was doing most of the lecturing. They were doing the paperwork, which was super fine by me. And then all of a sudden I realized that I had to go do some other things. But I always started out my groups with a simple lesson. And that lesson is, how'd you get here? Are you here because you got a DUI? Are you here for drugs? Are you here for some kind of violence? And I'd say, if so, don't bother spinning your wheels by telling me that your mother and dad are responsible, or your brother and sister, or anybody else. And how old are you? When you get 16 years old, you begin to make your own choices. And you know what? You are responsible today for your choices. And we can start from there. That's a nice place to start. But I don't want to hear about all this crap of blaming somebody else, because that's all it is. It doesn't work. If you're going to be responsible and you want to make changes in your life, then you have to realize that you have to give something up. And tell me, what are you willing to give up? That old lifestyle that you want to brag about? Because that's what it was. That's all it is. That, I used to talk about going out and getting drunk and drinking a case of beer, taking 500 milligrams of Demerol, or, different kinds of drugs. That's all you're doing. You're bragging. And that's exactly when you go to AA, what do? You tell your stories. Well, I didn't want that to be that here, and it wasn't. And until later when I bowed out. But I always start out with that. And then I would say, people drink initially because they want to have fun. And they drink because mom and dad drank, and brothers and sisters drank. And that's a fun way to be, and you can laugh and raise hell and walk away. Nobody's going to say anything. The next reason they drink, by the time they're 18, 19 years old, they drink because they can escape the reality of what it is in their life that they don't like. And that from there, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to addiction. Because then they're escaping all the time. Every time somebody gets in their face, or every time they get a bad grade or something doesn't go right for them, they turn to the booze or the drugs. And that's exactly how it happens. So from this day on, you can put that stuff behind you, because it's not going to work here. You are responsible for being here. Your dad, your mom, your kids, the dog, the cat, they didn't get your DUI. You got it. And so here's the thing. If alcohol is causing you problems, alcohol is the problem, or a drug. You take the alcohol or drug out of your body, you act the behavior behind the person you are. You put the drug and the alcohol back in your body, you act out the behavior behind the drug. And oh yes, I'm sorry to say, you're still responsible. So with that in mind, let's start. So today you're going to start a new life. And what that means is you have to change the direction of your life. I'm not changing it. You have to. And if you don't want to, that's okay. Go out and drug and drink. And when you can't stand it anymore, please come back and see us. We'll be glad to take your money. You can't talk your way out of problems you behave yourself into. And so if you're going to make some changes, you have to have a guideline. And I would suggest you look at it from this point of view, because it's very simple, it's very honest, And you have to say to yourself, have I liked my choices up until now? Obviously you haven't. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. So I would say this, beginning with the end in mind, how do you want people to remember you when you're no longer here? Then you use that as a frame of reference by everything you do on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, a yearly basis, is measured in the overall picture of who you want to be mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The 4 aspects of our life that are supremely important. And so let's talk about mentally. Where do you want to be mentally? Where have you come as far as your education is concerned? If you haven't got an education, then you're wasting your time. You need to either get a GED or go to a trade school. And I firmly believe that to be true. And once you have that and you have disciplined yourself, not only to come to treatment, you've disciplined yourself to go to the classroom, sit down your studies, and take notes just like you're doing here so that you can remember what you're learning. And you won't have time to go horse around. You'll be doing the job that you set up for yourself. You have to do this for yourself. So mentally, we learn something, we do something with what we learn, and we find enjoyment in what we're learning and doing. That's not fun. Total different ball game altogether. That's enjoyment. And enjoyment is what brings meaning to your life. That's mentally. And physically, you know how screwed up your body gets when you're using drugs and alcohol. No doubt about it. Alcoholism and drug addiction cause many secondary diseases. And it starts when you're young. It does not wait until you're older. It starts when you're really young. Therefore, you have to determine what you're going to do with yourself. Are you going to lay around at the house all day and shoot the breeze? Or are you going to get active? Because there's all kinds of things you can do to be active and help your body grow with your mind. Because if you're not using your mind, it doesn't grow. If you don't use your body, it's going to get fat and lazy. And that's what I would tell them. And when you think of mental, physical, emotional, and there's the catch, folks. Most people who live on their emotions, most alcoholics live on their emotions. There is no reasoning. As we talk about emotionalism, I need to come back to the mental side of who we are. And it's very important because our Creator, in His infinite wisdom, He gave us a brain. And that brain is powerful than many, many, many computers by far. It gathers information, it stores the information, and on instant recall, it brings that information up so we can use it. And when we are making our choices, that's the information we use to determine how we're going to make our choices. So when we come back to emotionalism, all of a sudden we find that living on our emotions is not valid. And the reason it's not valid is instead of responding to our mind and our thinking, our understanding, and doing something with what we understand, we're reacting emotionally. And when we react emotionally, we pay a horrible price for that. And many times when people are emotional about stuff, that's the vehicle to relapse. It allows them to go back out and get drunk and justify it. So that doesn't make any sense to me. So the combination of having our brain power or our mind with emotions is we have to balance that out. And the way we do that is we realize, not rationalize, we realize what's emotional and what's mental, strictly mental. Emotion is a combination of a lot of things that's happened in our past, blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't mean anything. Why? Because it's already done. There's not a particle of sense of bringing that stuff up and going over it again. And when it comes to the spiritual side of who we are, that's important because a lot of people don't like to believe in God. They don't like to believe in a higher power. The things that are truly important to everybody, whether they recognize it or not. If you've ever seen somebody dying on the battlefield, who are they calling for? God. Why? Higher power. They want to be somewhere besides dead. It's that simple. It's no different here. But if you'd like a simple example of a higher power, I would say this to you. If all the air in this room would suddenly evaporate, you would not care a lick or a promise about what I was saying. What would you be doing? You'd be heading out the door, going after what? Air. Higher power. Did we create the air? No, we didn't. Higher power. So I never get involved with arguments about spirituality because everybody has their own idea. But to give an example, that's the best example I can give you. And the good thing about it is nobody can refutate it. That's solid ground stuff, because there's not one of us can create air to manage this whole universe. It's not possible. Let me tell you about alcohol. It's really simple. Alcohol is anesthetic. It anesthetizes the brain. No matter what anybody says about the stuff, that's exactly what it does. So it lowers inhibitions along with it. And to give you proof of that is really simple. It takes about 1 second. When you take the water out of alcohol, what do you have left? Ether. Ether was a general anesthetic that was used during the Second World War, and they stopped using it because it caused so much damage on the liver. Well, woe be me. What do you guess happens? How many alcoholics develop liver disease and die from liver disease? There's your answer. There's the biology of alcohol. That's what it does. It also creates other kinds of diseases, such as diabetes, because the high content in alcohol of sugar, no doubt about it. And of course, that's bad eating habits too, but nonetheless, that's a fact. To me, that's the biology. The rest is just adding icing on the cake, but that's the most important part. The thing about alcoholics is, over a period of time, they will go to their favorite taverns or jive joints to drink, and they begin to isolate themselves from their families. And because their families, they don't want their families to know what's going on. And then they start to manipulate their families. The sad part about that is a manipulator will always turn one family member against the other. So pretty soon they have everybody up in arms with each other, so they're not looking at what they're doing. And that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to cover their own behavior. And that's really sad because it's very difficult to overcome that. Then they think they're smarter than God and they become control freaks. And the pattern repeats itself over and over and over. And the number one liar I ever met in my life was an alcoholic. They can lie when the truth and answer better because that's all they know. They absolutely do not understand the truth. And unfortunately, many times in their own mind's eye, they believe they're telling the truth, and they're not. And that's extremely difficult and sad that, that they have to go through that. But until they get a little sobriety in their bodies, their mind won't open back up so they can think. There's no clear thinking in their brain at all. And that continues until, sometimes it's a good 6 months before their mind starts to work properly after they stop. And they go out and do all these things like DUIs and stealing cars and having assault and fights and stuff in taverns and all that. And they think they're warriors and they think they're tough. And tough guys finish last. Alcoholics finish last. And it's only when they realize that they've alienated themselves from their family and they have any desire to get it back involved with their families, some never do, that they might open their minds up to a change of lifestyle and recovery. When you're growing up and you're going to school, you're maturing at a certain rate that the teachers allow you to when they teach you, or they program you, either way. And I mean, that really happens. And when you start drinking and using drugs, you're programming yourself to stay in the same place. And why is that? You don't have any choice. You're anesthetizing your brain. So by the time you're 21 and you're still drinking, your maturation cycle is not at 21. It's still at 13 or 15. So they're behind 7 years right up front with their maturation cycle. So the idea about maturation and sobriety is once you stop drinking, you got that 7 years to catch up in your head. And that's not done easy. It's done by a regimen of education. Because as I said before, when you're drinking, you're anesthetizing the brain. So every aspect of the brain is not functioning at a level that allows you to mature. So you act that 13-year-old boy behavior, 13-year-old girl behavior, and you're still responsible. And that's pretty sad, because it's very hard to overcome that. That's some of the dilemma with growing up. And that's what alcoholics and drug addicts have to do. I don't care if they're 13. I don't care if they're 50. I know people that are 50 years old that's come through our program that were still kids in their head. They laughed and giggled, blah, blah, blah. Not a brain cell working. And what they had to do is they had to grow up. And I always take a verse out of the Bible that was always interesting to me. One time I was put in a position where I could make a nickel for every Bible verse. So I sat down and I memorized Corinthians in all 13 chapters. But there was one verse that stood out to me, and it was simply this. Not that I'm a big Bible back or anything. It's just that this verse stood out for me. And it went something like this. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. When I become a man, I put away childish things. And that verse for me told me everything I need to tell our clients about growing up after they stop drinking, because that's exactly what it is. Many of them, these people coming here at 40 years old, are not grown up. They're still boys and they're still girls. Even though they're married and have kids, they still are boys and girls. That's because their maturation cycle stopped. When you're an alcoholic, over a period of time, you develop a tolerance. And because of that tolerance, you start having withdrawal pains. And let me tell you something, there's nothing fun about them. And that's because you've anesthetized that tissue. And it's been anesthetized so long that it doesn't want to wake up anymore. Is it any wonder they have withdrawals from alcohol or even drugs? None at all. That's going to be happening. If you think you're going to drink down here for a year and a half and not have repercussions, then your mind's in the wrong place. You're sitting on it. It's just simple fact. Well, the thing about a reservation, I love them dearly. No question about it. They're in my heart and soul. Well, as you know, most reservations, most tribes are circular. They are in an enclosed environment. And the dilemma with that is you have to have somebody who is in charge of that environment. And in this case, it happens to be tribal councils. And when you have a drug and alcohol program set up on a reservation, the people who are actually in charge is not the people who are running the program, it's tribal council members. And the dilemma I've seen is I have a friend today that works at a tribe, and no need to say who, but if he sends a client back into the first phase of treatment, and that client goes and complains to his uncles who's on the tribal council, and then that tribal council member comes to the counselor and tell him, no, you leave him where he's at. They take the decision right out of the counselor, which makes him totally ineffective. And it enables the client to go out and drink. And that's exactly what they do. And I've seen that time and time again as it relates to alcohol and drugs and treatment programs on reservations. That's the one thing I couldn't deal with. Because how do you train somebody or teach them about being clean and sober if you're going to be contradicted every time? And I've seen it in 5 different tribes that I could mention, but I won't. It's not necessary. And that's just facts. We've had a lot of wonderful Indian people come down here to go to treatment from different tribes. And the glory of it is I started to teach them in the same way that I taught everybody else. We didn't have talk about races. That was forbidden. And that's just how that's how we went about it. I said, if any one of you in this room, whether you're black, white, or Asian, or Caucasian, ever needed a blood transfusion, would you refuse to take it from a Caucasian? Would you refuse to take that blood transfusion from a black person, or a Native American, or a Mexican person? No, you wouldn't. Why? Because there's no difference. Our blood is all alike. It has different kinds, negative, positive, blah, blah, blah. But nonetheless, that doesn't change who we are. So it doesn't make any sense to be talking about racism when you're in a program where you're all the same. We have the same blood. Our blood is all the same color. It's all interchangeable. And I mean, that's how I tried to keep all the racism and stuff out. But people would bring it up. Well, I'm this and I'm that. And I said, that may be true. But here, it doesn't mean a thing. Because this is not about race. It's not about culture. It's about you being a drunk. And that's how we approach it. And it always worked. I never had a black person or a Native American or a Chicano. I never had anybody talk about one counselor ever in 35 years talk about us being racist. Not one time. And that's the reason, because we never talked about race as an issue. They may want to talk about it, but I just tell them the truth. Hey, you know, there's nobody here that's a racist. We don't talk about race because it's not about race. It's about your behavior. I never let them bring that back onto us, because when they do that, they're trying to make us feel guilty. And I don't feel guilty about anything I say. Not at all. If you feel guilty about what you've said, then you shouldn't have said it in the first place. And you see, from me, I'm not a shame-based person. Shame is a self-imposed sentence. How do you want to hold yourself in shame? How long? How long do you want to hold yourself in shame? Really good question. But alcohol and drug addicts do it all the time. Oh, I did this, but they whine. And you got to get them past the whining before they can learn. Mark, when you get down to the bottom line, we are the sum total of all the choices we make on a day-to-day basis. And if we make choices that don't serve us, or we become subservient to other people's choices, then all of a sudden you're going to pay the consequences. So if you're going to go out and drug and drink, if you're going to go out and act like an idiot and fight and all that stuff, then you're put in a position where you're going to pay consequences. It's that simple. If you're going to do something, before you do it, you have to ask yourself two questions. Do I want the good of this, or am I willing to pay the consequences for what I do? Take your pick. It's your choice. You want to pay the consequences? Oh, go do it. Bye. Because you can't stop it. And that's the simple truth about consequences. There's consequences to everything we do in our lifetime. I've paid mine many times. And everybody else pays consequences for one thing or another. But if you dwell on the consequences, you never get past it to find the good. Well, the thing about families is a difficult thing to talk about because every family has a different structure. And, you know, they can call some an enabler and all these kinds of things. I choose not to do that. When a family becomes dysfunctional behind alcoholics and drug addicts, even one of them, they're all dysfunctional. And consequently, they all need to get all the information they can about alcohol and drugs so that they can train themselves. Not the person that's drinking necessarily, but they can train themselves what's right and wrong for them. Because you're not going to change that person's mind that's drinking and drugging. Intervention, yeah, they help. But there's a lot of people that have been in 20 interventions. So each family member has to make up their own mind what they're willing to tolerate and what they're not willing to tolerate. And there's always a family member that's a scapegoat and all these wonderful little toy names that really doesn't mean anything. Because in families where there's no alcohol and drugs, there are some family members that are high achievers. And there are some family members that were not gifted to have that kind of achievement because they didn't have the mental acuity or they didn't have the ability to focus. Has nothing to do with alcohol and drugs. Biggest problem for tribal communities is because they allow the stinking drug dealers on and the people drinking on the reservation in the first place. And just because they're a tribal member doesn't mean they have the right to go on that reservation and ruin other people's lives. And that's exactly what they're doing. I would take every drug dealer and every person that's running around selling booze on a reservation, and they would be off the reservation. When they could show that they have been to a treatment program, they're clean and sober, they would be able to come back. But drug dealers would never come back. Never. And only to prove that is how many people have died on reservations from drug dealers come on that reservation selling drugs to tribal members. That is a dilemma that I can't deal with. If I had my way, I'd deal with the drug dealers. I would have to say there's a tribe in Canada, the Mohawk Cree. Now this is years ago and I haven't been there since. They developed a program that was pretty righteous, really, really, really good. And they had absolute guidelines at that time for how they dealt with their tribal members. And if anybody was on that reserve that was selling drugs, they were gone. And that was really successful. Since then, I would think, even though there's been deaths here, Muckleshoots have a pretty good tribal program. They hired people from outside the tribe to come in and be counselors. They took one of our counselors, and he's a very good counselor, very good counselor. And the only problem with this program is that the tribal council interferes with it. But other than that, they've been pretty successful. If I was a Federal Reserve and I had to tell people how to stay clean and sober, I would say, here's your opportunity. Come to this treatment program, absorb all the information that they're going to teach you, and you take that back out in the labor market in your home area where you live and work and stay clean and sober. If not, I'm going to take you to reserve and put you on that reserve for a year where you don't have any choice but to be clean and sober. And you're going to go to school all the time you're there. And if you don't have a trade, besides going to alcohol and drug treatment for education, we will train you in some kind of a job so you can go back out and go to work without any excuses. Because as long as you keep allowing that wheel to rotate, they're going to do that because it's the easy way out. And that's what they've learned from the time they were youngsters in many cases. First of all, you got to get them clean and sober. Once you get them clean and sober, free of drugs, free of alcohol, for a year, probably 80% of the mental health issues will go away. And once they go away, then they can be developing a plan for their life. And it really takes that long. I mean, we had a man came here, and he was a great guy. He come here and started our program, and he went all the way through the program and was a month from completing the program. And he found himself driving down 167, Highway 167, and he pulled off 167 into Renton, pulled up to his old watering hole and realized he was going back to the same tavern where he started. And he jumped in his truck and he come back here to this agency and he walked into Karen's office and he told her, Karen, I need to start all over. It's on my own dime. I have to do it. Because I just drove into my old tavern without a conscious thought. That tells me that subconsciously I was still thinking about it. And he started his program all over again and completed it. And that's the awareness you get when you go to a program where you learn something. You're not babysitted. And babysitting drunks is a waste of time because they'll make a fool out of you. They'll tell you everything you want to hear. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work for them. It doesn't work for the counselor. And over time, the counselor becomes frustrated. And many times, many counselors relapse for that very reason. Why? Because there's no satisfaction in what they're doing. And we've had that happen here twice, where counselors went back out and started using. And that was really, really sad because one was really gifted, but he couldn't stand all this stuff that was going on with the clients. It was, constantly bringing bad feedback to him. And that was when we started on early. And I think that's really important. So you got to keep grounded. And you stay grounded by teaching alcoholics to think, understand, have a realistic understanding of what they're thinking, and then do something with what you understand. And that's what brings satisfaction to your life. The best way is not to get involved with them emotionally. And that's what counselors do. They sit there and listen to their damn stories about what they were doing when they were drinking and drugging. And pretty soon, guess what? They're wrapped up in that story. They're feeling sorry for that client. And that client knows exactly what they're doing. Because once you get a counselor's sympathy, he might as well walk out of the door. He might as well go dig a ditch, work in a restaurant. Because when you get it wrapped up with a client emotionally, you're done. You're no longer effective. And that's a fact. Because their stories is all done. Okay, the minute they stop drinking, they start a new life. Why would you want to look out the rear view mirror or the rear window in an automobile or the rear view mirror in your car when all of a sudden you're not drinking anymore and you're going to be clean and sober? That's all said and done. Now you look out the windshield. Going forward, everything's in front of you. Very rare. I've never told my story ever in my lifetime. And I didn't drink very long. When I did, I drank a lot. But once I quit, it didn't mean anything to me anymore. I knew that was not the way I wanted to live my life. But having sympathy? Oh no. They got themselves there. And if they want to use sympathy, which they do with counselors, and the counselors go, "Oh, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," they're dead in the water right there. That doesn't solve the problem. So I just tell them, I don't want to hear that. This is not about what you went through or how bad a time you had it. This is about what you're going to do from this day on, period. Everything in the past is a rerun of the same old movie. And we'd sit here and have to listen to it from 10 people every day, talk about that rerun of the same old movie, and pretty soon you're so saturated with it that you're not moving forward anymore. You're in the process of relapse. And that's exactly what it is. When you see a counselor that relapse, you know that he's gone through this very process, this very experience, and it set him back years. Not days or months, years. That's right, educate you. And you're to educate them in such a way when you sit around in a circle and talk that they can tell you what they learned on that day from that lecture, from your doing your job and educating them. And when they learn from that day, just go down to 3 days down the road when you have 3 lectures under them and say, "What did you learn on this day?" Call them on it. They got a notebook. "What did you learn on this day?" And you keep going back and forth and back over and over because you're reinforcing it. They don't realize it at a time, but that's what happens. We had a man come to this program who was a bigwig at Boeing, and he could have gone to any number of hotshot programs, but because we were closer to Boeing here, he came to this program. He went all the way through this program, 2 years, deferred prosecution. At the end of 2 years of treatment, he came up to me and said, and he had a PhD in physics. Oh God, the guy was brilliant. And he said to me, he said, "You know, Michael, coming to this program for me is like having a 4-year degree in humanities." That's what he told me. We had 2 pilots who did the same thing. I didn't let him tell a bunch of BS stories. I just, "Hey, you may be a pilot, but you're here to listen to me. That's my job. Your job is to listen. I put the lectures on the board, you write them in a book." And they had awful good feedback when it come time to talk about what they learned. And they were learned people. And to have them in with people that were not was the best thing that could happen. Because they weren't trying to be intellectual. They took a simple little lecture in the simple form of English language, and they put it in the same terms and give it back to these people that was not afforded the ability that they had for education. And they respected me. They come back and visited us time and time again. Perseverance. That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing. They stuck with what they wanted their tribe to do until they had damn near complete sobriety. And they worked hard at it. A lot of people fell by the wayside. A lot of people were hurt. But Dad was a good influence. And Philip was a good influence. Dad spoke with him, in that video.
Yeah, Phil Lane Sr.
Yeah, Phil Lane Sr. was in it too. And it's perseverance. If you start something and you quit, you lose. I can't imagine starting something and losing. I couldn't do it. I've never started something and quit. I've started things and had to walk away because it wasn't right. And I lost a lot of money doing that. But I wasn't the loser they were, because they lost a good friend. And they lost business that would have been viable because I started the business and set it up, and it was going, but they got greedy. Same thing with treatment. If they had to give up on their tribe and they hadn't stuck to their guns and not allowed that alcohol and drugs on their reservation, they would have never made it as far as they've had now. The Shuswaps are really smart people. I really respect them. Well, the thing I'd like to pass on to other people is if you have no goals in your life, then you have no future. Because in order for us to be productive, we have to have a goal. And we were meant to be productive. Why? Because we have a mind. It wasn't meant to be saturated with garbage. It was meant to learn to do something and do something that we learn and find enjoyment. And that would be my hope for anybody that stops drinking, is to find enjoyment in their life. No, I wouldn't do anything differently. Once I got past the state of Washington and all their silly ways of doing treatment, and that's what it was. It was silly. It was silly to sit in a circle and talk about your problems. That's for AA. You want to go to AA meetings? They required 2 a week. That was fine. But treatment isn't about AA. It's about educating them. It's about giving them hope. And you know what hope is? Hope is healthy, open people with ethics. And that's what we try to do with the people that come to our program, to once again get them plugged into ethics, because that's who we really are. If we have no ethics, we have no personal fortitude. We have nothing inside where we're drum beats. Nothing. And so, no, I wouldn't change anything. Once we started to educate them, instead of sitting in a circle crying and whining and sniveling all the time, everything changed here. That's the greatest difference I've ever seen in any treatment program. And other programs emulated it, no question about that either. So it's not that we set a guideline or a baseline for everybody else, but when people went to other treatment programs and they'd say, oh my God, we went up to this place up here because they moved and there's just no bottom to it. It's nothing, Michael. They moved away because of work. And so that was a good answer to me. We were doing the right thing. And we didn't do the right thing for myself or Karen or Denise. We did it for our clients. That's why I changed things around. And then the state come in and started changing regulations, and you have to take you 2 hours to do a damned evaluation. Well, when we started and we started educating them, we could now do an evaluation in a half hour. And now Karen and everybody, the counselors, got all so wrapped up in paperwork that they never had no time with clients. So if you can keep the state out of anything that has to do with the recovery process or treatment process, that's the best thing that the state could do, is say, okay, you guys are on your own. You don't need to be regulated. If some guys in a treatment program that's not doing things right as a counselor, then there ought to be accountability. But the state of Washington should not write guidelines for treatment at all. Reason is because most of them aren't trained to. Most of them aren't counselors. They're civil service employees. You know what that means? 6 months probation and 19 years and 6 months retirement. Huh. That's how I feel about it. And I've got myself in trouble for saying that. And I have said it in Olympia because it's the truth. They were going to take my license away from me one time. Oh yeah, all the time. We had a guy come back from our second program 30 years ago, second or third program, come back and visit us just 2 weeks ago. We have him come back all the time. We had a guy come back, about a year ago. He had come to our program, big 325-pound guy, had a wife and 5 kids. He was a beer drinker, got a DUI with a breathalyzer of 3.2, and he was madder than hell because he got a DUI, and he came in here and sat down and talked to her, and he said, I'm madder than hell. She said, why? I got a DUI. And she said, why are you mad? You had a breathalyzer of 3.2, and he drank every day. And he says, on a given day, I always drink at least 3 cases of beer. Literally. So he decided he better do the deferred prosecution or lose his job, because he had a company truck. And Karen went to bat for him, and she went to court for him. And he come in here and started treatment. And boy, was he sick. Whoa, you talk about withdrawal from alcohol. That big fat boy, he had problems. He was really, really sick. But you know what? He came anyway. And he started through this program, and about half through his program, he was still working for the outfit he was working for, but he didn't like it anymore. He was sober, and everybody else was drinking and wanted him to go drink with him. He was standing in line at Wells Fargo's bank in Kent, and the manager was talking to another guy just 3 feet away from him about a contractor that didn't show up and take care of his business. And our client stepped out of line and said, "Sir, I'm a contractor. I can do that for you." And he says, "You can give us a bid right now?" He says, "Yes, I can." He says, "You have a contracting license?" "Yes, I have." He says, "I don't have them with me, but I'll go get them." And he give him a bid and he says, "Okay, you got it. You bring your contracting license and we'll hire you." So he went and got his brother's contracting license because he didn't have contracting license. His brother stuck on it as an addendum, put his brother on it, and they picked up the Wells Fargo contract, and he started remodeling Wells Fargo banks all over the country. First he started out with 4 employees, then he had 200, then he had 500 employees working for him. And his wife and him lived in a new home, and they had everything going for him. And he was clean and sober. So those are the things that can happen. But you can't do that when you're talking about what you did when you was drinking or drugging. You can only do that when you educate them and they're looking forward. And the opportunity seen it. And if he had still been drinking, he would have never seen the opportunity. He would have been too busy waiting to get to his old watering hole so he'd get drunk. But he seen the opportunity, took it. And he never forgot us. And he'd come back and visit us.